On my sister's 34th birthday, she looked right at me in front of 200 guests and said she wanted me to disappear instead of giving her a gift. I didn't argue. I didn't even glance at the velvet box in my purse holding the platinum earrings I had saved for months to buy. I simply stood, felt every eye follow me, and walked away, never guessing that by night's end, someone else would make her regret every word. The chandelier light in the Sentinel's ballroom caught in the sequins of Amberly's dress as she stood center stage holding a microphone like she owned the entire evening. I sat at a round table near the back, my nameplate card perfectly centered in front of me, untouched since I sat down. I had come because Eleanor, my mother, called twice this week and said it would mean a lot to the family if I showed up. That phrase always meant I'd regret it if I didn't. I told myself I'd stay an hour, smile politely, maybe leave before dessert. Amberly was thanking her guests, her voice floating easily over the low hum of clinking glasses and muffled laughter. She listed friends, co-workers, even her yoga instructor sprinkling compliments like confetti. I sipped my water, wishing it were wine, counting the minutes, until I could slip out unnoticed. Then her eyes found mine. It wasn't a warm glance. It was a lock-on, a slow narrowing that made my skin prickle. Instead of a gift, she said, "I just want you to disappear." The words landed like a slap in the silence that followed. You could almost hear the air shift, a collective intake of breath, followed by a few awkward chuckles from people who didn't know what else to do. I felt the burn rising in my cheeks. My hand froze halfway to my glass. For a second, I thought maybe she was joking. Maybe she'd laugh, wave it off, move on. But Amberly just smiled, a perfect poised smile for the room, like she'd delivered a punchline everyone was supposed to agree with. My stomach turned. Around the table, no one met my eyes. I glanced toward Eleanor. She sat 2 tables away, her posture rigid, hands folded in her lap. Our eyes met for the briefest moment. No shock, no frown, not even a flicker of disapproval. Just that cool, unreadable expression I knew too well. Then she looked away toward a man telling a joke at her table. The music swelled softly in the background as Amberly passed the mic to the DJ. People clapped, a few shouted congratulations, and the evening rolled on like nothing had happened. I couldn't. The sound in the room dulled like I was underwater. My chair scraped loudly against the parquet floor as I stood. A couple of heads turned, but most pretended not to notice. I walked toward the exit, the scent of expensive perfume and champagne clinging to the air. My heels clicked too loudly in the quiet between songs. At the coat check, the attendant smiled politely and handed me my jacket without comment, though I caught the slight pause in her eyes before she looked away. Out on the sidewalk, the cold Portland night hit me full in the face. Neon from the hotel's sign reflected in the wet pavement. I pulled my coat tighter and started walking with no clear direction, just needing to put blocks between me and that ballroom. My phone buzzed in my clutch. A message from an unknown number lit the screen. "Hope you got the message tonight." I didn't need to wonder who it was from. My thumb hovered over the delete button, then I locked the screen instead and kept walking. Somewhere behind me, the faint thud of music leaked from the hotel's walls, the party still going without me. I stopped at the corner under a street lamp, the light casting a pale circle on the sidewalk. My reflection in the boutique window beside me looked like a stranger, someone with shoulders drawn too tight, eyes too sharp. The sting in my chest was more than embarrassment. It was the kind of humiliation that sticks, that burrows in deep. I exhaled slowly, tasting the bitterness in the back of my throat. A town car pulled up to the curb near the hotel entrance. Amberly's laughter carried faintly across the distance, sharp and unbothered, like the words she'd thrown had been nothing more than casual banter. I turned away before she could see me still standing there. The traffic light changed, and I crossed the street without looking back. Somewhere down the block, a storefront glowed warm and inviting against the cold. I didn't know yet that my feet were already carrying me toward it, away from the echo of her voice, and into the next step I hadn't planned. The storefront glittered like a beacon in the dim February night, its window lined with rows of velvet stands holding pieces that seemed to hum under the light. Bellamy's jewelry. I had passed it countless times when I still lived downtown, always telling myself I would walk in when I had something worth celebrating. Tonight wasn't exactly that, but my chest felt too tight, and my hands itched for something to hold onto that was mine. Inside, the warmth wrapped around me, instantly carrying the faint scent of polished wood and expensive perfume. A tall man in a charcoal suit greeted me with a professional smile and stepped aside to let me wander. My heels sank softly into the plush carpet as I moved toward a glass case filled with earrings, their stones catching the light like tiny sparks. One pair pulled my attention immediately. Platinum drops, each holding a single flawless diamond that seemed to breathe under the spotlight. The small plaque read 3200. My throat tightened. My throat. $3,000 could pay for months of groceries, a plane ticket somewhere far, the safety net I kept promising myself I'd build. But the thought of walking away with nothing felt heavier than the price tag. The saleswoman approached, her smile easy, but her eyes assessing in the way people in high-end stores sometimes are. She asked if I wanted to try them on. The cool metal brushed my skin as she fastened the backs, and when I caught my reflection in the mirror, something shifted. I looked less like the woman who had just been humiliated in a room full of people, and more like someone who could walk out and decide her own worth. I told her I'd take them. She led me toward the counter, chatting politely about the unseasonably cold winter while she rang up the purchase. My credit card felt heavier than usual in my hand as I slid it across the screen, flashing with the total before I tapped to pay. The chime above the door jingled, and the sound scraped across my nerves. Laughter followed, loud and sharp, the kind that made you turn whether you wanted to or not. Amberly's voice floated in first, carrying that unmistakable mix of fake sweetness and razor edges. She was flanked by two women from the party, still in their sequined dresses, cheeks flushed from champagne. They swept in like they owned the place, and my stomach dropped as her gaze locked on me in an instant. "Well, look who's here," she said, her tone dripping with mock surprise. I focused on the glass countertop in front of me, on the way the cashier's hands moved quickly but without panic. Amberly closed the distance between us in slow, deliberate steps, the metallic click of her heels echoing in the quiet shop. She leaned just close enough that her perfume wrapped around me, all white florals and something sharper underneath. "Spending your rent money on jewelry now, Maddie?" She let out a small laugh, turning slightly so her friends could hear. "Guess priorities change when you don't have anything else going for you." I felt the words press against my ribs like a fist. The saleswoman stiffened, but kept her eyes on the box she was wrapping. The man in the suit glanced over from across the store, his jaw tightening. I could have ignored her, could have taken the box and walked out without giving her the satisfaction. But my pulse was already quickening, the heat rising in my face, not from shame, but from the simmering need to reclaim at least an inch of ground. "Enjoy your shopping, Amberly," I said evenly, my voice steady enough to surprise even me. Her smile widened, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, I will. Especially knowing you're paying top dollar for something you'll probably have to pawn next month." I heard her friends laugh behind her, the sound bouncing off the glass cases. The saleswoman slid the small velvet box toward me, her hand lingering just enough to meet my gaze. "We have cameras," she said quietly, almost like a warning or a reassurance. I slipped the box into my clutch and turned to leave, brushing past Amberly with just enough space to avoid her shoulder. Her perfume lingered behind me as I stepped toward the door, the cold night air waiting like a breath I had been holding too long. But my hand had barely touched the door when I heard the low, steady voice from behind me. "Don't lay a hand on her." I froze, the words anchoring me mid-step. The tone wasn't loud, but it cut through the air like glass breaking in another room. When I turned, a man I hadn't noticed before stood near the watch display, tall and composed, his dark suit tailored sharp against broad shoulders. His eyes were on Amberly now, and for the first time all evening, her expression faltered. The manager had moved closer, his hands clasped, eyes flicking between us. The saleswoman was no longer wrapping jewelry, but standing still, as if waiting to see what happened next. The hum of tension in the room was almost tangible, and I knew without a doubt that whatever came next was not going to be quietly forgotten. Amberly's eyes flicked toward the man by the watch display, her lips parting just enough to show a flash of irritation. Then, as if to prove no one could speak to her like that, she turned back to me, and her hand came up fast. The sting cracked across my cheek before I could even process what was happening. Gasps rippled through the store, sharp and quick like dropped glass. My head turned slightly with the force of it, the metallic taste of adrenaline flooding my mouth. I heard my own breath before I could hear anyone else's voice. That man's voice came again, firmer this time. "Don't lay a hand on her." Amberly froze mid-step toward me, her shoulders tightening. The man moved forward, closing the space between the watch counter and where we stood. His presence was steady, controlled, the kind of calm that made people listen without needing to raise their voice. The store manager, a woman in a navy skirt suit with her hair in a neat twist, appeared from behind the counter. Sophie Lane, according to her name tag. She looked directly at me, then at Amberly, and said in a tone that carried authority without shouting, "We have this on camera." The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment before Amberly let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Oh, please, Maddie's fine. She's always been dramatic." Sophie's gaze didn't waver. "I suggest you leave her alone before I call the police myself." Amberly shifted her weight, looking around the store as if expecting someone to back her up. Her friends were suddenly quiet, busy pretending to examine a display of bracelets. The man stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "She's not fine, and you know it." I touched my cheek, the warmth blooming under my fingertips, a reminder that this wasn't some petty exchange of words anymore. My pulse was racing, but my voice came out quieter than I expected. "I'm okay." Sophie's attention shifted back to me. "You should file a report. It's assault and the footage will make it clear." The idea made my stomach tighten. Part of me wanted to walk out and never see this place or these people again. But another part, the one that had been walked over too many times, was starting to push its way to the front. Amberly crossed her arms, chin tilting up. "Go ahead, Maddie. Call the cops. See how that looks for you." The man gave her a look that was almost pity. "It will look like what it is." Sophie glanced toward the back of the store where a small security camera blinked quietly in the corner. "I've saved the footage," she said. "It won't go anywhere." Amberly's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something uncertain crossing her face. But she smoothed it over quickly, letting out a slow exhale through her nose, before throwing me one last look, the kind that promised this wasn't finished. Her friends trailed after her as she walked toward the door, the click of their heels receding into the night. The chime rang again as the door shut, leaving the store in a stillness that felt both fragile and loaded. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My fingers still brushed over my cheek, not from pain now, but from the shock of someone crossing that line so easily. Sophie rested her hand lightly on the counter. "If you change your mind about calling, come back or call me directly." I nodded, my voice catching in my throat. "Thank you." The man stayed a step back, watching me with an expression that was hard to read. There was no pity there, no condescension, just a quiet steadiness. "Are you all right?" he asked finally. I nodded again, though I wasn't sure if it was the truth. "I think so." He glanced toward the door where Amberly had left, then back at me. She shouldn't have gotten away with that. I didn't know what to say, so I tightened my grip on the small velvet box in my hand and took a step toward the exit. The cold air outside seemed sharper now, almost welcome. From behind me, Sophia's voice carried across the store. "We'll keep the footage on file, Madison." Hearing my name said with that kind of assurance did something small but significant inside me. I stepped out into the street, the city lights blurring for a moment before coming back into focus. Somewhere in my chest, a decision was beginning to take shape, even if I couldn't name it yet. The drive back to my apartment in the outskirts of Seattle felt longer than usual, the highway lights blurring into streaks against the windshield. My hand stayed tight on the steering wheel, the imprint of the velvet box pressing into my mind as much as the bruise on my cheek. By the time I pulled into the cracked asphalt lot outside my building, the night had settled into a damp stillness. Inside, the familiar scent of coffee grounds and laundry detergent greeted me. I hung my coat on the back of the kitchen chair and sank into the couch without turning on the main light. The small lamp by the window cast a warm circle over the coffee table, highlighting the unopened mail and my laptop left from this morning. The quiet gave too much room for old memories to slip in. I could see myself at 8 years old standing in the backyard while Amberly twirled in a new dress Mom had bought her just because. I had been holding the hem of my own hand-me-down skirt, already knowing not to ask why. Eleanor's smile for Amberly had been warm and unguarded, the kind she rarely gave me. Dad Richard would be there too, sitting in his lawn chair with a beer, nodding along to whatever Mom said. He never stepped in, never said that maybe things weren't fair. It wasn't in his nature to stir trouble. It was easier for him to let the imbalance slide, like it wasn't eroding anything important. That same pattern had followed us into adulthood. Amberly got the attention, the support, the benefit of the doubt. I got lectures about being realistic, about knowing my limits. When I left my job in Portland, after a year of dealing with a toxic manager who undermined me at every turn, Mom had called it impulsive. She didn't care that I'd been losing sleep and skipping meals just to keep up. Freelance work was supposed to give me freedom, but most days it felt like treading water with no shoreline in sight. I made enough to cover the bills and keep the lights on, but there was never quite enough to relax. Still, it was mine, and no one could take credit for it but me. The vibration of my phone on the table snapped me out of the past. I reached for it, half expecting another notification I didn't want to see. Instead, the subject line of the email on the lock screen stopped me cold. Innovate Tech. Interview invitation. I opened it, reading each line twice to be sure I wasn't imagining it. They had reviewed my portfolio and wanted to set up a video interview later this week for a senior creative position. The kind of role I had quietly dreamed of, the kind that could shift everything if I got it. I leaned back into the couch, letting the possibilities soak in for a moment. My fingers hovered over the reply button when another notification flashed across the top of the screen. A message from Amberly. Hope you learned your lesson today. The words sat there, black against white, small and neat, but the weight of them pushed hard against the small flicker of hope I'd just felt. My thumb rested against the edge of the phone, torn between deleting it and keeping it as proof. Part of me wanted to laugh, because the lesson she thought she'd taught me wasn't the one I was learning. The other part felt the familiar pull toward anger, that restless energy that came from years of being pushed aside. I set the phone down face down on the table and stared out the window at the distant glow of the city. The rain had started again, tapping against the glass in soft, uneven patterns. I watched it blur the streetlights and thought about the job interview, about the bruise on my cheek, about all the times I'd chosen to walk away just to keep the peace. The silence in my apartment was different now, filled with something that wasn't resignation. I reached for my laptop, pulling it onto my knees. The cursor blinked against the empty reply window to Innovate Tech, and my hands began to type. I woke up to the pale light of morning slipping through the blinds, my phone buzzing softly on the nightstand. I reached for it, still half under the covers, and opened the inbox to reread the email from Innovate Tech. This time, I noticed something I had somehow skipped over the night before. The signature at the bottom wasn't from a recruiter. It was from Harrison Blake, creative director. I sat up slowly, the name pulling last night's scene in the jewelry store back into focus. I could still hear his voice, steady and unshakable, telling Amberly not to touch me. My eyes moved over the lines of the email again, looking for anything that hinted at why he had reached out. There was nothing beyond the polite professional invitation to interview. It should have felt like pure luck, the right place and the right time. Instead, a knot formed in my stomach. Was this a genuine opportunity, or the fallout of an embarrassing scene he couldn't unsee? I imagined him going back to his office, still thinking about the woman in the store who had been slapped in front of everyone. Maybe this was his way of throwing me a lifeline, or maybe he actually thought I could do the job. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and padded into the kitchen, setting my phone on the counter while the coffee maker sputtered to life. The thought of walking into an interview where the person across the table had witnessed one of my worst moments made my chest tighten. But the other truth was harder to ignore. This was the kind of chance that didn't come around often, and I'd be a fool to let it pass. Coffee in hand, I opened my laptop again and searched Innovate Tech. Their portfolio was sharp, inventive, the kind of work that made you stop scrolling. The role was exactly in my lane, leading a creative team on campaigns for national brands. I pictured my name under their banner, my ideas going out into the world with their backing. That vision felt dangerously close to hope. Still, the doubts kept circling. I thought about all the times someone had acted like they were doing me a favor, like any success I had was owed to someone else's generosity instead of my own skill. I hated the idea of walking into that office with a question mark over my head. I clicked back into my inbox and stared at the blinking cursor in my draft. Finally, I typed a short, measured reply, accepting the interview, and sent it before I could overthink it again. The whoosh of the sent email echoed in my apartment louder than it should have. For the rest of the morning, I tried to bury myself in client work, but the pull of the upcoming interview kept breaking my focus. Around noon, my phone buzzed with a calendar invite from Innovate Tech for Friday afternoon. There was a short note attached. "Looking forward to meeting you again in a different setting." I read the line twice. Meeting you again. My hands stilled over the keyboard, my mind running through what that meant. It was friendly, but also intentional, like he was acknowledging what had happened without putting it into words. I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair, the hum of the refrigerator filling the room. The decision was already made, but the reality was sinking in now. I was stepping into a room with someone who had seen me at a low point, and I'd have to prove that I belonged there for reasons that had nothing to do with pity. That night, I laid out a folder on the table, filling it with my best work samples. As I slid the printed portfolio pages into place, I caught myself adjusting the layout again and again until everything felt exact. I wanted no doubt in his mind about why I was sitting in that chair. The city outside my window was quiet when I finally stepped back from the table. The folder sat there like a sealed promise, and I realized I was ready to walk through whatever door this interview opened. The next morning, the sound of my phone rattling across the counter cut through the quiet of the apartment. I was halfway through pouring cereal when I saw the name flash across the screen. Mia Reynolds. I hadn't spoken to her in months, not since I left Echelon Media. I swiped to answer, tucking the phone between my ear and shoulder. Her voice came fast, low, like she didn't want anyone nearby to overhear. She said she thought I should know Amberly had been calling people from the old office. According to Mia, she'd been telling anyone who would listen that I'd stolen concepts from a client pitch right before I quit. The kind of rumor that clung like oil and was almost impossible to wash off. I stood frozen in the kitchen, the cereal forgotten. My first instinct was disbelief. Amberly might play petty games, but dragging my name into something that could cost me work felt calculated in a different way. Mia said she had overheard it herself when she was walking past a conference room. She sounded angry for me, but also nervous, like repeating it might somehow spread it further. I thanked her, my voice steadier than I felt, and promised I'd handle it. When we hung up, I leaned on the counter and stared at the condensation sliding down my coffee mug. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. 2 days before an interview that could change everything, and Amberly was planting seeds of doubt in the one place my reputation mattered most. By late morning, I needed air. I pulled on a jacket and walked down to the cafe on the corner, the one with the scratched wooden tables, and the smell of cinnamon that drifted out onto the sidewalk. As I waited for my order, the bell over the door jingled, and in walked Amberly with a woman I recognized from old photos on her social media. They didn't see me tucked into the side booth. I kept my head low, pretending to scroll my phone, but their voices carried over the hum of the espresso machine. Amberly's tone was bright and sweet, the way she talked when she knew she had an audience. She was telling her friend that she'd made sure people at my old company knew the truth about me. Then came the part that tightened my grip on the phone. She said I would never outrun the label of a thief. For a moment, I pictured myself standing up, walking right over, and tearing the words out of her mouth in front of everyone. But my pulse slowed just enough for reason to push through. Public scenes were her specialty, not mine. And if Harrison or anyone at Innovate Tech caught wind of this, I wanted them to see the contrast between us without me lifting a finger. I let them leave first, watching through the window as they crossed the street. Amberly's laughter trailed behind her, sharp and knowing. I waited another minute before stepping out into the cool air. The sidewalk smelled faintly of rain, and I breathed it in until my shoulders loosened. Back home, I sat at my desk and opened my old project files. I pulled up the pitch decks and time-stamped drafts that proved the ideas in question had been mine from the start. It wasn't about sending them anywhere yet. It was about knowing that when the time came, I'd have more than my word to stand on. The rest of the day I kept busy with small tasks, anything to keep from replaying the cafe conversation. But each time the image of her leaning in to deliver that line came back, it only solidified my choice. The truth had a way of surfacing when you let it, and when it did, I wanted her to watch it happen. The glass doors of Innovate Tech slid open with a soft hiss. As I stepped inside, the faint hum of activity wrapping around me. The lobby smelled faintly of cedar and coffee, and every surface gleamed like it had been designed to impress, without trying too hard. A receptionist greeted me and offered water while calling upstairs. My palms were cool despite the knot in my stomach. A few minutes later, Harrison appeared from the elevator, a slim leather portfolio in his hand. He wore the same calm expression I'd seen at Bellamy's, but here it carried an authority that filled the space between us. We shook hands and he gestured for me to follow him into the elevator. The ride was quiet, except for the soft ping of each passing floor. On the 12th, we stepped into an open workspace filled with natural light and the low murmur of people in focused conversation. Harrison led me to a glass-walled conference room where a large monitor glowed with a blank canvas. I expected the usual interview questions, but he didn't sit down right away. Instead, he opened his portfolio, slid a single sheet toward me, and said he wanted to see how I approached a problem in real time. The brief described a complex rebranding project for a tech client on a tight deadline. It wasn't just a test of design, but of strategy, timing, and judgment. I asked if there was a specific format he preferred. He only shook his head slightly and said he was more interested in my process than a polished pitch. He left me with the room, a laptop, and the quiet pressure of the task. The first 30 minutes, I immersed myself in research, pulling up the client's existing branding, market positioning, and user feedback. My pen moved steadily across a notepad, sketching rough ideas, while my mind tested and discarded concepts. By the second hour, I had a direction that felt sharp and cohesive. I built the visual framework, anchoring it in a narrative that tied the client's history to their forward goals. Time seemed to compress the outside world, shrinking to the glow of the monitor and the steady rhythm of my typing. When the 3-hour mark approached, I exported the prototype and arranged my notes in a way that would make my reasoning clear. Harrison returned right on time, closing the door behind him. He didn't speak at first, just stood behind me as I walked him through the design choices. I pointed out how the typography carried the brand's established trust, while the color palette hinted at innovation. The messaging was distilled into a single line that could anchor their entire campaign. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the screen again. The silence stretched just long enough to make me wonder if I'd missed something obvious. Then his mouth curved slightly, not quite a smile, but close enough to release the tension in my shoulders. He said it was rare to see someone capture both the emotional core and the practical needs of a client in such a short time. He closed the laptop and told me they would be in touch soon. The words were professional, but the tone carried more weight than a polite dismissal. As he walked me back toward the elevator, there was a steadiness in his stride, like he'd already made part of a decision. When the door slid shut and the building began to sink away beneath me, I caught my reflection in the brushed steel. My hair was slightly mussed from hours of focus, my eyes sharper than when I'd walked in. I stepped out into the afternoon light with the faint sense that something had shifted, even if I couldn't name it yet. The invitation to dinner had arrived that morning in the form of a short, carefully worded text from my mother. She said it was time to put things behind us and have a civil meal. I could almost hear her voice in the choice of words, smoothing the edges so no one could say she'd taken sides. By the time I pulled up to the familiar driveway, the sun was sliding low, casting the front windows in a soft amber glow that made the house look warmer than it had ever felt to me. Inside, the dining table was set like we were expecting company from a magazine shoot. Silver-polished napkins folded into shapes that looked like they had taken practice. My mother stood at the end, greeting me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Amberly was already seated, her blonde hair falling perfectly over one shoulder, Trevor beside her, and my father at the far end, with a glass of wine in hand. I sat opposite Amberly. Conversation started politely enough, circling around weather, local events, and my father's garden. But it didn't take long for Amberly to steer the current where she wanted. With a tilt of her head and a little laugh, she said it was hard to keep a job these days, especially for people who struggled with consistency. The words were light, but they landed heavy. My mother looked down at her plate. My father sipped his wine. I opened my mouth, but before I could speak, Trevor set down his fork with a deliberate clink. His gaze moved from Amberly to me, and then back to her. He said he knew what she had done, that the rumor about me stealing ideas hadn't just appeared out of nowhere. Amberly's smile froze for half a second before she let out a scoff. She asked if he was really going to take my side over his own fiancée, her tone sharper now. Trevor didn't flinch. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. With a few taps, a recording filled the air. It was Amberly's voice, unmistakable, telling someone over drinks how she had made sure no one at my old company would want to work with me again. She laughed in the recording, calling it a lesson I needed to learn. The words seemed louder in the quiet dining room than they would have in any public place. My father's fork paused halfway to his mouth. My mother's hand tightened around her wine glass. I didn't move, didn't breathe, as Amberly leaned back in her chair, her face shifting between disbelief and anger. She accused Trevor of betraying her, demanded to know why he had been recording her at all. Trevor's voice stayed calm, but there was steel under it. He said some things needed to be kept in case the truth ever had to be proven. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator in the next room. Amberly's cheeks flushed a deep pink, but she didn't apologize. Instead, she pushed her chair back, muttered something about not being hungry, and left the table. The silence she left behind was thick enough to touch. I kept my eyes on my plate, not trusting my face to hide the mix of vindication and disbelief running through me. Across the table, Trevor caught my gaze for a second, then looked away as if to say this wasn't over. And I knew he was right. Trevor slid his phone closer to the center of the table and opened an email thread. The subject line had my name in it, along with the title of a project I had poured months into. He scrolled just enough for my mother and father to see the sender. Mia Reynolds. The words in the email were straightforward, dated months back, confirming that the concept and preliminary designs were mine and mine alone. He didn't stop there. With a flick of his thumb, a string of text messages appeared on the screen. They were between Mia and Amberly. In them, Mia confronted Amberly about spreading the theft rumor, warning her that it could ruin a career. Amberly's replies were smug and unapologetic, brushing off Mia's concerns and insisting that I needed to be taught my place. My father's hand went flat on the table, the movement soft but final. My mother's face was pale. Her lips pressed so tightly together, I couldn't tell if she was holding back words or emotion. The weight in the room had shifted, and for once it wasn't pressing down on me. Amberly laughed, but it was a brittle sound, not the effortless charm she usually wielded. She said Trevor was overstepping, that Mia was just as unreliable as I was. No one responded. The silence stretched until it became something solid, something she could feel pressing back. My mother's eyes flicked toward me, then to the screen in front of her. She didn't defend Amberly. She didn't speak at all. That absence said more than anything she could have voiced. Amberly's chair scraped sharply against the floor as she stood. Her movements were too quick, her hands too tight on the back of the chair. She muttered something under her breath that I couldn't catch and turned toward the doorway. The sound of her heels on the hardwood carried into the hall. Then the slam of the front door rattled the silverware in its place. The vibration settled into the room like the last note of a song no one wanted to hear. Trevor leaned back, exhaling slowly. My father reached for his wine but didn't drink. Just stared at the dark liquid, as if it might hold a different ending. My mother stayed still, her gaze fixed on the tablecloth, one hand resting lightly over the other. I didn't say thank you to Trevor. I didn't need to. The proof was there, and the silence around it was the clearest acknowledgement I had ever received in this family. The room felt both lighter and more fragile, like the first breath after a long storm. The call came the next morning while I was making coffee, the rich scent filling my small kitchen. A calm but firm voice introduced himself as Officer Daniels from the Portland Police Department. He explained that Sophie Lane from Bellamy's Jewelry had submitted video footage of the incident with my sister. They had reviewed it, and the evidence was clear. Amberly had committed an act of assault. I stood at the counter, one hand resting on the edge, listening as he told me they would be serving her with a citation and an official warning. He didn't need me to come in unless I wanted to pursue further charges, but for now, the process was in motion. I thanked him, my voice steady, even as a ripple of something vindication maybe ran through me. By mid-afternoon, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Mia. She lived a few streets over from Amberly and had just seen a police cruiser pull up in front of her house. I didn't ask for details, but a part of me couldn't help picturing the scene. Amberly's neighborhood was the kind where lawns were perfectly trimmed and every porch had the same seasonal wreath. The kind where people noticed if your recycling bin was out on the wrong day. When the officers knocked on her door, half a dozen blinds probably tilted open. According to Mia, Amberly answered in a silk blouse and tailored pants, the image of composure. That image cracked fast when Officer Daniels handed her the envelope. She glanced toward the street, maybe hoping no one was watching. But they were. A neighbor walking her dog slowed down, pretending to fuss with the leash while sneaking a look. Another leaned against his mailbox, clearly listening. Amberly's voice rose just enough to carry, insisting there had been a misunderstanding, that this was all blown out of proportion. Officer Daniels stayed calm, explaining the nature of the citation, the legal implications, and the fact that the footage was indisputable. Her eyes darted between the officers and the cluster of neighbors now lingering along the sidewalk. That polished mask she wore so well began to falter. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, then crossed her arms, then uncrossed them, unable to find a stance that looked in control. When she finally signed the acknowledgement form, the pen scraped against the paper with a kind of finality. She handed it back without meeting anyone's eyes. The officers thanked her for her time and walked back to their cruiser. Mia said Amberly lingered at the doorway for a moment, scanning the street as if daring someone to say something. No one did. They didn't need to. The scene had already written its own headline in the minds of everyone watching. I set my phone down after Mia's last text and stared out the kitchen window. The late afternoon sun was slanting across the rooftops, catching on the edges of the rain gutters. Somewhere deep inside, I felt a quiet shift, not loud or triumphant, but solid. A piece of the imbalance between us had finally been set right. I didn't know if Amberly was more upset about the legal notice or the way her neighbors had seen her receive it. Either way, the damage to her perfect image was done. I poured the rest of my coffee into the sink, the bitter liquid spiraling down the drain, and let the quiet of my apartment settle in again. The email arrived just after 9 the next morning, its subject line simple enough to make me read it twice before opening. Innovate Tech was offering me the position. My eyes scanned each line, taking in the details, the salary, the start date, the benefits. But what made my chest tighten wasn't the formal language. It was the sentence near the end where Harrison wrote that his decision had been based solely on my skill and my ability to adapt under pressure, not on any personal sympathy. For a moment, I just sat there, my hands resting lightly on the keyboard, letting those words settle. After weeks of tension, public humiliation, and whispered rumors, here was something unshakable. I had been chosen for what I could do, not for what had been done to me. I called the number at the bottom of the email. Harrison's voice was warm, but precise when he answered. We spoke about the next steps, the onboarding schedule, and the first projects he wanted me to oversee. He mentioned the test I had completed, how it had revealed not only my technical proficiency, but my ability to navigate ambiguity. It was the kind of compliment that didn't just feel polite. It felt earned. When the call ended, I stood in my small living room, the early light pooling across the hardwood floor, and let myself breathe. This was the kind of moment that didn't need an audience. No one to clap, no one to post about it online. Just me and the knowledge that I had turned a string of insults and sabotage into something valuable. My eyes drifted toward the small velvet box on the dresser. I crossed the room and opened it. The platinum earrings rested inside their clean lines, catching the light. I remembered the sharp sting of Amberly's voice in the store, the way she had looked at me like I didn't belong there. I took them out and fastened them, the cool weight against my skin, both grounding and electric. In the mirror, I barely recognized the woman looking back. Not because my face had changed, but because the set of my shoulders had. There was no flinch left, no waiting for the next blow. Just a quiet steadiness that felt stronger than anything I had worn before. The rest of the day passed in small, ordinary tasks: laundry, answering a few freelance client emails, making a grocery list, but each one carried a different undercurrent now. There was a job waiting for me, a future I had chosen instead of one I had been forced into. That night, as I closed the curtains, I caught my reflection again. The earrings glinted once in the dim light before disappearing into shadow. I smiled not because everything was fixed, but because I finally believed I could face whatever came next. The morning light in Seattle had that washed gold tone that makes everything feel cleaner than it is. I was halfway through my first cup of coffee when an email alert pinged on my phone. It was from an old coworker I hadn't heard from in years. "Madison thought you should see this." Attached was a link to an industry blog. I clicked before I could second-guess it. Amberly's face stared back at me from the header image framed by a headline that left little to interpretation. Major lifestyle influencer dropped from 3 brand contracts following ethics concerns. The article was merciless in its detail, citing anonymous sources' public records and a growing social media thread that had already gone viral. There was no mention of me, but the incidents they outlined were familiar, eerily so. I scrolled slowly, the names of her partners and sponsors leaping off the page like mile markers on a road I'd already traveled. This was not just the Bellamy's incident. The article tied together years of smaller stories, quietly canceled collaborations, sudden falling outs, whispered warnings among PR teams. What had been dismissed as gossip was now documented fact. Over the next week, the ripple spread. Her Instagram comments turned from heart emojis to sharp questions. Mutual acquaintances began ghosting her online. She stopped posting polished stories from her condo downtown. It was Trevor's statement that landed the hardest. In a carefully worded post, he announced the end of their engagement, citing irreconcilable values. People read between the lines. I didn't need to. I already knew the truth behind those words. One evening, while I was reviewing a design proposal in my apartment, my phone lit up with Mom's name. We hadn't spoken much since the dinner where Trevor played that recording. I answered anyway. Her voice was smaller, missing that steel edge she usually wore when the topic was family. She asked about my new job. She didn't mention Amberly until the end, and even then only to say she hoped I was taking care of myself. There was no defense, no attempt to reframe, just a quiet acknowledgement that she knew what was happening. I found myself walking past Bellamy's on my lunch breaks now and then. The display windows had changed with the season, but I could still spot the exact shelf where those platinum earrings had rested that day. Sometimes I would pause, adjusting my coat, catching my reflection in the glass. There was no sting anymore, only a kind of calm. I remembered the hum of humiliation, the urge to shrink, and how instead I had chosen to walk forward. That choice had built everything I stood on now. At Innovate Tech, my days filled with projects that pushed my skills further than I expected. Harrison had a knack for giving me work that was just beyond my comfort zone, forcing me to stretch. I thrived under that challenge. My team valued my input not because of some scandal in my past, but because my ideas worked. There was something deeply satisfying about earning trust on merit alone, especially after years of having my worth questioned. I didn't seek revenge in the way people imagine it. No grand confrontation, no final speech in a crowded room. Amberly's undoing didn't need my hand. It came from the simple math of her own choices catching up with her. People she thought would shield her stepped back. Opportunities she assumed would always be there dried up. and she had to stand in that reality without the safety net she'd always counted on. The last time I saw her was by accident. I was leaving a client meeting at a cafe downtown when she walked in. She looked thinner, paler, the confidence in her stride replaced by a kind of wary scanning, as if bracing for another blow. Our eyes met for half a second. I didn't stop, didn't speak. Her expression flickered something between recognition and regret, but I kept walking. That was all the closure I needed. Karma moves at its own pace. It doesn't ask for your permission, and it doesn't arrive on your schedule. But when it comes, it leaves no room for pretending. I had learned that holding the line, even when it cost me, was worth it in the end. Not because it changed her, but because it changed me. If there's one thing I hope you take from this, it's that your value is not up for negotiation by anyone who wants to cut it down for their comfort. Protect it fiercely. Trust the truth to surface in its own time, and when it does, let it stand on its own. And if my story resonates with you, if you've been where I was standing in the quiet after someone tried to erase you, share your voice. Leave a comment. Tell me your story. Because somewhere out there, someone is waiting to hear the words that will tell them they are not alone.